Okay, this chart contains the portfolio frontier for Lululemon and Apple, all those different weighting schemes that we did in class today. I've also included point G, which was where we put, I believe, 10,000 of our 50,000 in the risk-free rate, and the other 40,000 was allocated 80% in Lulu and 20% in Apple. I've also added the risk-free rate, which has an expected return of 3% and a standard deviation of 0. And then in the video that you watched before this one, we added or calculated the values for a couple of other points. One point I will call point F. That was our expected return of 5% with a standard deviation of 2.4%. That's when we had 40,000 in the risk-free rate and the other 10,000 allocated 80% Lulu and 20% Apple. I want to add that point, and we know it's going to fall somewhere where around where my cursor is, right about here. But to add it so that it's exactly perfect, what I'm going to do is right-click on the plot area and choose Select Data, and I'm going to add a point. I'm going to call that point F, and it has an X value, which is the standard deviation of 2.4%, but I have to input that as a decimal. And this seems really weird to me, but I have found I have to put a leading 0, so I can't just type 0204, or sorry, 024. I actually have to type 0.024. It seems like if I started off with a decimal, the period, the point, it interprets that as text, and it interprets everything after it as text. But if I start it with a 0, it interprets it as a number, which is what I want. It took me quite a long time to figure that out. Okay, so my standard deviation is 0.024, 0.024. My return is 0.0501. And it has added that dot right here with this gray diamond. And I want to add a data label, so I'm just going to click that dot, right-click it, and say Add Data Label. And it put the expected return as my data label, and that's not really what I want as my label. So I'm going to format my data label and tell it to do the series name as my label. And so then it just labels it point F. Now, at point F and at point G, I was a lender. I put a certain proportion of my money in the risk-free asset. So essentially I bought a treasury bill, and by doing so I lent money to the U.S. government. If I fell right here at this dot, the orange dot, I'm lending all my money to the government. So I'm lending 100% of my money to the government. If I plot here at point F, I'm lending 40,000 of my 50,000, or 80% to the U.S. government. If I fall at point G, I'm lending 10 of my 50,000, or 20% to the U.S. government. I could lend half my money to the government. I could lend 99% of my money to the government. I could lend just 1% of my money to the government by buying treasury bonds. This lending CAL stands for capital allocation line. It's basically just saying what return would you generate if you lent money at different percentages. Right now, it's saying you're lending 100% of your money, so you're plotting right here at this orange risk-free dot. But as I move this cursor along, it's changing the weights that you're lending to the government. Here, I'm now at point F, so I'm lending 80% of my money to the government. And as I scroll along, I'm lending more and more of my money to the government. Or, sorry, less and less of my money to the government. Here, I'm putting about half my money in risk-free treasury bills and about half in the 80-20 allocation of Lulu and Apple. To get to point G, I just lend less to the government, put more in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combination. That gets me to point G. So at G, I'm putting 80% of my money in Lulu and Apple in an 80-20 allocation, and 20% I'm lending to the government. And if I scroll this bar all the way to the bottom, then I'm actually not lending any money to the government. I'm putting all my money in the 80-20 combo of Lulu and Apple. Now, as I showed you in the first video, it's also possible to borrow money. Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. This orange line, as it is currently drawn, is also called the lending line. So it represents the returns that you could achieve in this particular case by putting a portion of your money in the risk-free rate. At point F, it's 80%. At point G, it's 20%. And the remaining portion in the 20-80 Apple Lulu combination. But it's also possible to borrow money and buy on margin. And if you were charged margin rates of only the risk-free percentage, which isn't true, you're actually charged more than that. But if you were charged margin rates of only the risk-free rate, then we could accomplish that point K that I showed you in the previous video. I want to add that one to the chart. So I'm going to call it K, and it has a standard deviation of 0.2404 and a return of 0.2314. So it plots up here at this blue square, and I'm just going to add the data label and format the data label to contain the series name. Point K was accomplished by taking my original $50,000, borrowing another $50,000 at the risk-free rate for a total of $100,000, and investing all of that $100,000 in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combination, which is right here where my cursor is. I didn't have to borrow $50,000. I could have just borrowed $25,000. That would accomplish a point that's approximately right here where my cursor is. So I'd have my original $50,000, borrow another $25,000, giving me $75,000 that I would invest all in the Lulu Apple combination. Or I could have just borrowed $10,000. That would give me a point approximately right here where my cursor is. So I'd take my original 50 plus 10,000, put 60,000 in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combo. That would accomplish a straight line between this red square and this blue square. So I'm going to draw this line, and it's still orange. I should have changed it to a different color. But as I move my slider bar down, it's finding all the different possible returns and risk combinations I could generate by borrowing some money, putting all that money that I borrowed plus my original amount in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combo. When I programmed that slider bar, though, I didn't program it to go all the way up to point K, so it has stopped and it won't go any further, but I could have programmed it to do it that way. Probably should have. Point K, though, is the maximum I could accomplish, because the most they'll let you buy on margin is 50% of the purchase price. So if I had $50,000 and I borrowed another 50,000 for a total of 100,000. That means my equity is 50% of that and the loan is 50% of that, and that currently is the margin requirements. So I couldn't really go past point X. Sorry, point K. I'm not going to take the time right now to reprogram my spreadsheet to draw it all the way out to point K, though. The things that I want to demonstrate will hold true even if my line doesn't extend all the way out to point K. The next, oh, from this red square extending up on the orange line is called the borrowing line, or the borrowing capital allocation line. It's just how you're allocating your money, your capital. So this entire orange line is called the capital allocation line, or it's also called the borrowing lending line. Now, the question is, could I accomplish something better than the orange line that I have right now? For instance, if I could accomplish this blue dot, oops, but it's not in the right spot. If I could accomplish this blue dot, would that make me happier than point G? The question is, does the blue dot dominate point G? And the answer is yes. The blue dot offers me the same risk level, but a higher return level. And the question is now, how do I accomplish that blue dot? And it's not by manipulating this orange line. It's not by changing the values on the slider bar. What I essentially need to do, and actually let me restate something, changing the values on the slider bar, just change the weights that I have in the risk-free asset and the 80-20 Lulu Apple combination. So right here I've got X amount borrowed at the risk-free rate and my original wealth plus X amount invested at the 80-20 Lulu combination. Point G was lending 20% to the government at the risk-free rate and putting the remaining 80% of my money in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combo. Point F was lending 80% of my money at the risk-free rate and putting the other 20% in the 80-20 Lulu Apple combination. So every single point along this orange line involves some combination of the risk-free rate and the 80-20 Lulu Apple weighting. It only considers one weighting of Lulu and Apple, and that's the 80-20 combo. But so shifting my weights between the risk-free asset and the 80-20 Lulu combination will only give me different points along this orange line. It won't get me up to this blue dot. The only way to get that orange dot, the only way to get the orange line to get up to the blue dot is to pivot it along the risk-free point. The way to pivot it is to adjust my weights in Lulu and Apple. And one thing we know about Lulu and Apple that I talked about in class today is I would never put, I believe it's 36% and 64% of Lulu and Apple. I'd never put more than 36% of my money in Apple, because if I do that, I fall on this inefficient portion of the curve. And I would never put, less than 64% in Lulu. So I'd always be at 64% or higher for Lulu. I have a section of my chart right here that adjusts the percentages that I have in Lulu. As it changes the percentages in Lulu, it also changes the percentages in Apple. So if I were to switch this to 90% in Lulu, it would go down to 10% in Apple, although it never actually shows you that percentage in Apple. But what it does is whatever percentage that I have up here in the upper right, that's the dot and the weighting scheme that my spreadsheet uses to create this orange line. So I'm going to say that again. Whatever weighting scheme I have up here in this blue rectangle is the weighting scheme that my spreadsheet uses to create this orange line. It'll create a portfolio combining the risk-free asset, either borrowing or lending, and this portfolio of Lulu and Apple. So right now, it's combining lending at the risk-free rate and investing the rest in the 80-20 Apple combo, or borrowing at the risk-free rate and investing all of that at the 80-20 Lulu Apple combo. So if I change the values on this blue rectangle up here, it will change my orange line. If I decrease the value of Lulu, it's going to move my orange line intersection point to down here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I will just hold it down a bit, and it dropped it from 80% down to 66% in Lulu. Actually, I'm going to drop it a little bit more. I think the 64% in Lulu and 36% in Apple just happen to be the minimum standard deviation portfolio. And you can see that if I choose that weighting scheme of Lulu and Apple, things don't look that good. Point G was actually better than, this red dot was actually better than where my cursor is right now on the orange line. So lowering my weight of Lulu isn't a good idea. So I'm going to pop it back up to 80% to get us to our original position. So there we are. It looks like lowering the weight of Lulu is a bad idea. It's not going to accomplish this blue dot. But perhaps increasing the weight of Lulu will help things. So I'm going to increase it, and you can see that it is pivoting my orange line up. And I'm going to increase the weight of Lulu to as high as possible, to 100%. And you can see even at 100%, it's still not possible to accomplish that blue dot, mainly because I did a poor job of drawing that blue dot in the right spot. But I could accomplish this blue dot. How could I accomplish that blue dot? It's a combination of, in this case, lending at the risk-free rate, because it's from this red square to the left, I'm a lender at the risk-free rate. From this red square to the right, I'm a borrower at the risk-free rate. Since the blue dot falls to the left of the red square, or the tangency point between this orange line and my blue frontier, that means I'm a lender. So to accomplish this red dot, or sorry, blue dot, I'm going to lend some money at the risk-free rate. The part that I do not lend will be invested in 100% Lulu. And I don't want you to think that putting 100% of your money in the highest return stock is always the best way to go. It really just completely and totally depends on the shape of this frontier. I'm going to change the shape of the frontier. The frontier could have a different shape based on the beginning and ending dots. I'm going to just get rid of this line for right now because it's kind of interfering with some things that I want to talk about. But the shape of this frontier is determined by the expected return and standard deviation for Lulu, the expected return and standard deviation for Apple, because those determine the endpoints. But it's also determined by the correlation. The easiest thing for me to change is the correlation. So I'm going to change that correlation. I was using 0.42 because that's what we used in class, but now I'm going to change it to -0.3. and it is going to shift the shape a decent amount. And now what I want to do is just add my orange lines back in. You can tell that, and I know the font is not particularly pretty and things are overlapping, but right now this red dot, this orange line, is combinations of the risk-free asset either borrowing or lending and 100% in Lulu. But you can tell there are better points. There are points right here where my cursor is drawing that dominate the orange line. So 100% in Lulu wouldn't be a good idea if this blue frontier were the true frontier for Lulu and Apple. So I just don't want you to think 100% is always optimal, because that is not true at all. It just depends on the shape of the frontier. And if the frontier had this shape, to figure out the optimal weight to put in Lulu and Apple, what I could do is just change this slider bar until my line pivots, until it will pivot no higher. So the way to accomplish that is actually lower my weight of Lulu. So I'm going to lower my weight, and you can see my line is pivoting upward. It's also getting shorter, don't worry about that. So I'm still pivoting upward until essentially that red dot is tangent to the efficient portion of the portfolio frontier. So keep adjusting this weight until the orange line is tangent to the efficient part of my frontier. In this particular case, it occurs at approximately 75% in Lulu, 25% in Apple. And that's with the new correlation of minus 0.3, not with the old of 0.42.